Yo, what's going on, guys? Welcome to another episode of Forgotten Footballers. Today we're getting into the lost 10s. This is a really interesting episode for me because it's all about players in a position and with a certain style who just kind of got left behind by the game and the tactics and the way that everything just kind of evolved over the course of the 2010s. You know, we started off the decade with these luxury players being really prevalent and a part of the European game, and by the end of the decade, the modern 10s are pressing hard, leading the lines, and that's kind of those, you know, KDB, Bruno Fernandes style players that they look for nowadays. So these are some guys who just, you know, in my opinion, just came a little bit too late. And so I don't know, I feel like it's a really interesting topic with some interesting players, some of the most aesthetically pleasing guys to watch. And so I just want to go ahead and get into it. We're going to start with one of my favorites, Isco. Isco was one of the most gifted dribblers I ever watched play the game. This guy had such beautiful close control with the ball. He was unbelievable. The way that he was able to move the ball at speed, changing direction, all while keeping the ball so tight to his feet, it was genuinely beautiful to watch. He also had a brilliant eye for a pass, which made him such a handful for defenders, especially in one-on-one situations. You can't get too tight to him, you can't give him space. He was just such a dangerous player in the final third. His most prolific season came in 2016-2017, when in only 18 appearances, he scored 10 goals with 8 assists for Real Madrid. And he offered a lot more than that as well. He had 1.8 dribbles per 90 and an 89% pass completion. And I just cannot stress enough how much of a joy this guy was to watch. I mean, it was all like, the numbers are the numbers, but just watching this guy was such a pleasure. He was such an artistic footballer. And everything was really going great for Isco around this time in the mid-2010s, and that's when the game really started to shift away from those luxury players, and a combination of that with injuries really started to affect his career. On top of that, there was a lot of drama at Real Madrid at the time, with the managerial position switching over a few times, you know, from Lopetegui to Solari and then back to Zidane. It was just really hectic, and by the time Zidane got back into the post, which was like barely a year after he had left, Isco was already kind of out of the fold. After that, he kind of regressed back to that supporting role with Kroos and Modric and never really got back to that top level that we saw. But for those few seasons when Real were playing to Isco's strengths, I genuinely feel like that was the best creative midfielder they've had, and especially in an attacking sense, since Özil. I know that Modric obviously provides a lot, Kroos provides a lot, but those are more your box-to-box midfielders. With Isco and Ozil, these guys were more the final third players, and I mean, you just saw him play with a different type of technique, a different type of flow to his game, which just made him such a unique player. And again, like, that Ozil comparison might be a little odd, but I just feel like he's the only player since then who's captured that same ability with the creativity that Messi had at that time. It was a really unfortunate end to his time at Real Madrid. In his final season, he only put up 323 minutes for the club. It was really sad to see the way that he kind of just faded into irrelevancy at the club after being at such a high peak. This all led to a free transfer where Isco moved to Sevilla, and unfortunately, things didn't really pick up from there either. Isco only made 10 appearances for Sevilla this season, and in half of those, he got a yellow card. It's rough, man. It's not great. It's not great. He's still currently a free agent with his future kind of up in the air. And it's just a shame. I know I keep saying it, but this guy was such a pleasure to watch. I mean, I just miss him, man. I miss peak Isco. He was a really, really fun player, one of my personal favorites, and it's just, yeah, it's a bummer. His career is just one of those that kind of stings. Moving on to another one of my personal favorites, this was one of my favorite wonder kids of all time, Julian Draxler. What an interesting career, let's get into it. Kind of a similar package with what you got with Isco in the sense of just brilliant technique on the ball, able to attack the defense with the ball at his feet, setting up his teammates, going at the goal directly. He was just one of the most fun to watch diverse young players in the Bundesliga. His most prolific season came pretty early on in his career in the Bundesliga when he scored 10 goals with 3 assists. And that was in 2012-2013, back when he was lighting it up with Schalke, one of the hottest young prospects in the world. His goal contribution fell back a little bit the following season, but this didn't mean that he wasn't continuing his development, as we saw him take a much more critical role in the build-up. His goals dropped down to only 2 in that following season, 2013-2014, but his key passes rose from 1.5 per 90 up to 2.3, and he also doubled his assists in dribbles per 90. There was a World Cup right around the corner at the end of that 2014 season, and young Draxler had the world at his feet. He made his national team debut in 2014 at the World Cup, only with 1 substitute appearance, but he still claimed himself a winner's medal, so I mean, I'm sure it would have been hugely motivational for him going back to Schalke after that. This is unfortunately, though, where things begin to unravel for Julian. In the 2014-15 season, he suffered a tendon crack, which saw him miss a majority of the season, and that was what really started to set his career back and started a trend of a lot of things that we saw continue throughout the rest of his career. He got a transfer the following season to Wolfsburg, which kind of brought him back to his previous form a bit. In 19 appearances, he scored and assisted 5 times, which was putting him over 0.5 goal contributions per match, which, I mean, it was a really solid return for him. And at that point, he got a transfer to PSG. And the reason I'm saying it like that is because, in my opinion, this is the transfer that really kind of killed Draxler's club football career, and we'll get into all that. It wasn't all doom and gloom throughout his time at PSG. I just want to start with that. He actually did have a couple pretty solid seasons. If we take a look at 2017-2018 and following into the 18-19 season as well, throughout those 2 seasons, he made 41 league appearances with 7 goals and 12 assists, which again had him hanging out around that 0.5 goal contributions per match number, which it's not terrible, don't get me wrong, but the reason why I would say that being the peak of his time at PSG makes it a pretty resounding failure is he was surrounded by so much more talent in a league where he was now at the dominant team. He should have been stepping it up. He should have been doing it at the biggest European stages, and we just never saw that. You know, he barely kept it going at the same level he was at when he was at a mid-table Bundesliga club. It was just, he never took that step, and that was the real bummer. And once we kind of saw that being the top level that we were going to get from Julian Draxler, he started getting more and more falling out of favor with the club, dropping out of the rotation, and again, like, it was just, his career kind of crumbled as far as him being a club player, and he lost out on the tail end of his prime. He's still currently a PSG player, but he's out on loan at Benfica right now, and it's not going really well for him there either, unfortunately. And I mean, kind of the same finishing thoughts as I had with Isco, where it's just a shame, you know, it's one of those things where systems and injuries, poor transfers at the wrong time, it just kind of set him back and ultimately took away what could have been a really, really fun career for Julian Draxler. It's a real shame. And from one World Cup winning German to another, this last guy we're going to be talking about today is Mario Gotze. I'm sure you guys are familiar, especially if you were watching the 2014 World Cup. So before we get into everything, I just want to address what you guys might be thinking this is about, which is some of the medical issues and things that have held back Gotze's career off the pitch. And that's not at all what I really want to focus in on right now. For those of you who don't know, Mario unfortunately suffers from myopathy, which is a disease that affects the muscles. This has resulted in him missing many months throughout his professional career and kind of ended his time at Dortmund throughout his second stint. And, you know, we'll get into that a bit, but the time that I really want to focus in on doesn't have anything to do with that. It's actually his time at Bayern Munich before he got that transfer back to Dortmund. So I want to take you guys back to that kind of era before everything else happened. So just to briefly summarize how he got to Bayern in the first place, he was one of the hottest prospects in German football, right up there with Julian Draxler. He was playing for Dortmund in the early 2010s, doing really well, and he got himself a big transfer to Bayern Munich just before the 13-14 season that led into the World Cup. Mario was a much smaller player than some of the other guys I've talked about today in stature, which says a lot because we haven't talked about anyone who's super big. But Mario was a really small player. He made up for that though with some really brilliant technical skill, great change of pace, brilliant technique in tight spaces, and he kind of reminds me of what we see from Jamal Musiala today from Bayern. So I want to take you guys back to right before the 2014 World Cup. That's where our story with Gotze kind of begins. At the time, he's one of the hottest players in the Bundesliga. He's playing really well for Bayern. And then obviously the World Cup happens, and that just blows him into the next atmosphere. Scores the World Cup winning goal for Germany in the final against Argentina. It was a huge moment for him, and Bayern absolutely capitalized on that. He made his career high appearances that following season for Bayern in 2014-2015. He played 28 times that season in the Bundesliga and was a critical part of Pep's Bayern. And Pep, with the type of manager he is, no doubt appreciated that technical ability that Mario was bringing to the pitch. It was a different element to what a lot of the other Bayern midfielders brought at the time. This is when, unfortunately, things go awry for Mario when he's at Bayern, when he suffers an injury which takes him out for a majority of the 2015 season. And this was not ideal for Mario because at the time, Bayern were in a spot where they were struggling in Europe. They weren't able to take that final step forward in beating the Spanish teams and the Italian teams that were dominating at the time. And they needed to kind of switch things up and go their own direction. This is where we see a lot of those high intensity, pressure-based systems really finding their footing in the Bundesliga under that kind of Pep dominance with Bayern at the time. And a lot of that got started when Mario was out, unfortunately. This is when Muller comes back into the fray as one of the mainstays in the midfield. And the different profiles that Pep was looking for in these other players, by the time Mario got back, it was just not a fit. And Pep is a very decisive manager. I feel like once he's over and done with you, it's not really gonna happen from that point. You know, we just saw that with João Cancelo earlier this season at City. So I just feel like it was a similar situation where the football that Pep wanted to play at Bayern progressed past the need for Mario Gotze, and it was just one of those sliding doors moments. I just feel like that career path that he had at Bayern Munich is really fascinating and definitely emblematic of this whole lost 10's idea that I'm trying to talk about in this video. As he was out during that injury, Thiago and Vidal become the new midfielders for Bayern, and all of a sudden it's a totally new team. And while ultimately they were still never able to climb that mountain and become European champions, that was absolutely foundational to the play style that shifted away from the tiki-taka Pep Barcelona and into the dominant Pep City that we know him for today. You know, he's kind of fused different systems and different styles he's had over the years at City, but I feel like this time at Bayern when Gotze was out injured was genuinely transformational in Pep's career, and that ripple effect spread out throughout all of Europe. You know, the whole Gegenpress idea and just that whole German system has taken over and become the new modern fashionable thing in football. And ironically, in a weird way, I think Mario Gotze's injury as a butterfly effect thing has a lot to say in that. You know, of course it would have happened eventually, I'm sure, but the timing of everything, it just so happened that Mario Gotze getting hurt in 2015 led to the football that we see today. So yeah, those were the few players that I wanted to take a look at. Those were my lost 10's, you know, my guys that I still watch those dribble highlights late at night when I'm feeling nostalgic. You know, I'm sure some of you guys do the same out there, you know. It was a really fun era for football and a really interesting transitional period for the game, you know. We saw the slower, stagnant, technical style get thrown out the door and literally outran in Europe. And the game that we see today is totally unrecognizable to what we knew 10, 15 years ago, the game that I fell in love with initially. And so it's just fascinating. And I wonder today, you know, what sort of players are gonna be those, you know, left behind tactical players. I'm not really sure, but we'll just have to kind of see, you know. It's fascinating. It's an ever evolving, ever developing game. And I think it's important to take a look at some of these guys that might get lost in time, lost in a moment. For me, it's very nostalgic and sentimental to look back and think about some of these players from my childhood. So I hope you guys enjoyed just as much as I did. And yeah, that's all I got for y'all. Later.